At first, it was just a thin strip of grass. Then it became footprints. Then tire marks. Every morning, my lawn looked less like a home and more like a shortcut someone felt entitled to use. I watched from my window as the same woman crossed it again and again, smiling like nothing belonged to anyone but her. What she didn't know was that every step she took was pushing me closer to a decision that would change both our lives, and end her little habit forever. If you believe karma always finds a way, and that entitlement eventually meets consequences, subscribe now, because this story proves that sometimes justice doesn't shout, it waits. The first time it happened, I convinced myself it was an accident. New neighborhood, unfamiliar layout, maybe someone made a wrong turn. My front lawn was still fresh then, early spring green, the kind of grass that hasn't been stepped on enough to lose its softness. From my kitchen window, I saw her cut diagonally across it, heel sinking just slightly into the soil, expression calm and unbothered. She didn't look back. She didn't pause. She just crossed it like it was public land. I remember standing there longer than necessary, coffee cooling in my mug, the hum of the refrigerator behind me. It left a strange feeling in my chest, not anger exactly, but awareness. Like noticing a crack in a wall and knowing it will grow if ignored. By the third time that week, it stopped feeling accidental. The same woman, same time of day, same path. Always brisk, always confident, always crossing my lawn to save herself maybe 10 seconds of walking. The tracks became visible now. The grass bent and discolored where she passed. I told myself it was petty to care. That lawns recover. That confrontation creates drama. But something about the way she never hesitated began to feel intentional. I learned her name from the HOA newsletter pinned to the community board. Carol. Capital letters, bold font, listed as a board member. The same Carol who crossed my lawn like a boarder meant nothing. The same Carol whose perfectly trimmed hedges sat untouched on her own property. Each morning became a quiet test of patience. I'd hear distant traffic, birds in the trees, sprinklers clicking on down the street. Then the soft crunch. The unmistakable sound of someone stepping where they shouldn't. My shoulders would tense before I even saw her. And there she was, head high, phone in hand, cutting across again. I tried subtlety first. Small signs staked into the ground. Fresh mulch lining the edge of the property. I even adjusted my sprinklers to run earlier, hoping wet shoes might send a message. None of it mattered. She navigated around every hint with ease, as if the lawn had already been mapped in her mind. What bothered me most wasn't the damage. It was the dismissal. The way she never once acknowledged the space as belonging to someone else. There was a quiet arrogance to it, the kind that thrives on being unchecked. And in an HOA, unchecked behavior doesn't stay small for long. One afternoon, I stood outside pretending to adjust a flower bed when she approached. I expected eye contact, maybe even an apology. Instead, she veered slightly, still on the grass, and passed within feet of me without a word. The air smelled like cut clippings and warm pavement. I felt invisible on my own property. That night, I walked the lawn slowly, feeling the uneven patches under my shoes. Anger finally arrived, heavy and settled. I realized something then. This wasn't about grass anymore. It was about permission she never asked for and boundaries she clearly didn't respect. The HOA rules were thick and detailed. Pages of regulations about fence heights, paint colors, mailbox placement. Yet somehow, personal property lines were treated like suggestions, at least when it suited the right person. And Carol wasn't just anyone. She enforced rules on others while ignoring them herself. I could have filed a complaint. I could have argued. But I knew how that story usually went. Meetings. Deflections. Smiles that hid dismissal. I didn't want noise. I wanted understanding. So instead of reacting, I started watching. Not obsessively, deliberately. I noted times. Patterns. How she never varied her path. How confident she seemed that nothing would ever stop her. And as I stood there one evening, the sun dropping low and casting long shadows across my wounded lawn, an idea formed. Quiet. Patient. Perfectly fair. I decided then that if she insisted on crossing my line, I wouldn't stop her. I'd let her walk straight into the consequences she never saw coming. Once the decision settled in my mind, everything slowed down. Not in a calm way, but in that eerie, focused stillness that comes right before something irreversible. I stopped reacting emotionally to Carol's daily crossing. Instead, I observed it like a routine weather pattern, predictable, careless, inevitable. Every morning unfolded the same way. The neighborhood woke gradually. Garage doors lifting, engines humming, sprinklers whispering across lawns that were treated like trophies rather than homes. And right on schedule, Carol appeared. Confident stride, eyes forward. A shortcut taken without thought or apology. What she didn't know was that I had started treating my lawn differently. Not emotionally, strategically. I reviewed HOA bylaws late at night, the pages glowing faintly on my laptop screen. I learned which rules were enforced loudly and which were enforced selectively. Landscaping clauses. Property maintenance expectations. Liability sections buried deep enough that most residents never read them. I didn't skim. I absorbed. The lawn itself became a project. I didn't rush. Rushing would raise attention. Instead, I made changes so subtle they blended into normal upkeep. A reshaping of the soil here. A slight grade adjustment there. Nothing dramatic enough to notice casually. Everything purposeful enough to matter later. I hired no one. Outside help always left a trail of questions. Instead, I worked early mornings and late evenings, when the neighborhood was distracted by dinner or sleep. Dirt under my nails. Measuring tape tucked into my pocket. The smell of fresh soil mixing with cool dusk air. Carol never altered her path. Even as the ground slowly changed beneath her route, she walked it with the same entitlement. Her confidence was steady, and that confidence reassured me more than anything. She believed the shortcut belonged to her now. A week passed. Then another. The grass along her path stopped recovering at all. It flattened permanently, like a scar. Some neighbors noticed and asked casually if I planned to reseed. I smiled politely and said I was working on something. No one pressed further. The truth was, patience had become my greatest advantage. I noticed how Carol behaved toward others, too. The way she inspected lawns while pretending to jog. How she paused near trash bins, eyes narrowing, memorizing violations. She lived in rules, when they benefited her. That made what she was doing to my property even more offensive. Still, I didn't confront her. Not once. Silence unsettled people like Carol more than arguments ever could. One afternoon, I watched her from behind the blinds as she crossed while speaking loudly on her phone. She laughed. She gestured. She stepped exactly where I expected. The sun caught her sunglasses just right, reflecting a glare so sharp it felt symbolic. I wondered briefly if she would notice the change when it finally mattered. If there would be a moment of realization, confusion replacing confidence. That thought alone made the weeks of restraint worthwhile. By now, I had documented everything. Dates. Times. Photos taken discreetly from angles that showed clear property lines without being invasive. The lawn's progression from healthy to damaged. Her consistent disregard. The evidence wasn't for revenge. It was for clarity. Even the HOA, with all its internal politics, respected documentation when it became impossible to ignore. What struck me most during this time was how easily entitlement thrived in silence. How often people took advantage simply because no one stopped them. Carol didn't see herself as wrong. In her mind, the shortcut was harmless. Convenient. Beneath consideration. I started sleeping better than I had in weeks. There was relief in having a plan, even a quiet one. Anger transformed into anticipation. Each crossing felt less like an intrusion and more like progress toward an ending. Then, one morning, something unexpected happened. Carol paused mid-step. Just for a fraction of a second. Her foot hovered before landing. I held my breath behind the window. She looked down at the grass. Not closely. Not suspiciously. Just enough to register that something felt different. And then, without thinking further, She stepped forward anyway. That was the moment I knew it would work. Because true entitlement doesn't retreat when warned softly. It moves forward until consequences force it to stop. By the end of that week, everything was ready. Nothing illegal. Nothing dramatic. Just a perfectly constructed lesson waiting patiently beneath a lawn she believed was hers to cross. I stood outside that night, the moon casting pale light across the yard. The grass looked peaceful. Ordinary. Almost inviting. And I wondered how long it would take for Carol to realize that shortcuts sometimes lead exactly where you never intended to go. The morning it happened began like all the others. The air was cool, carrying the faint scent of damp soil and distant exhaust. Sunlight crept across the neighborhood in long, quiet bands, catching on windows and mailboxes. Nothing about the day suggested disruption. That was the beauty of it. Consequences rarely announced themselves. I stood inside, motionless, watching through the same window I had watched from for weeks. The lawn looked calm, almost pristine. Anyone passing by would have seen nothing unusual. The preparation blended perfectly with routine maintenance. Normal enough to dismiss. Precise enough to matter. Carol appeared right on time. Confident. Purposeful. Her posture broadcast certainty, the kind that comes from never expecting resistance. She approached at the same angle, steps matching the invisible groove carved by habit. I noticed something different, though. A subtle impatience. A quickened pace. She was running late. That detail mattered more than she knew. She didn't slow. She didn't scan. She trusted the path beneath her feet without thinking. Trust built on repetition. Trust that never survives change. The moment her foot made contact, the confidence vanished. It wasn't dramatic. There was no spectacle. Just a sudden loss of balance that looked almost comical for half a second. Her body jerked instinctively, arms tightening, weight shifting too fast in the wrong direction. The grass gave way beneath her shoe, and the ground responded exactly as it was designed to. She stumbled forward, catching herself just barely. The sound reached me even through the glass, a sharp, startled intake of breath, followed by the dull scuff of shoes scrambling for stability. She stood frozen after that. Completely still. I watched her look down. Really look this time. Confusion crossed her face first. Then disbelief. She tested the ground with her foot, carefully, like someone unsure whether ice would crack beneath them. The confidence she carried every day drained away in silence. She looked around, quickly. No audience. No immediate witnesses. That embarrassed her more than the misstep. She straightened and continued across, but the shortcut was gone now. Every step carried caution instead of entitlement. When she reached the sidewalk, she stopped again, turning slowly toward my house. I didn't move. She stared at the lawn longer than she ever had before. Not with anger yet. With suspicion. The kind that forms when something familiar suddenly stops obeying. Later that afternoon, the HOA message board buzzed quietly. Nothing explosive. Just a vague post about unsafe landscaping concerns and potential hazards. The language was careful, general, non-accusatory. But I knew the source immediately. Carol didn't mention names. She didn't mention addresses. She didn't have to. She assumed authority would do the rest. That evening, she crossed again. Slower this time. Deliberate. She tested the ground before committing to it, avoiding certain patches instinctively. But habit was stronger than caution. She still used the shortcut. Still ignored the obvious alternative. What struck me then wasn't her persistence. It was her refusal to reflect. The ground had warned her. Subtly. Fairly. And instead of adjusting her behavior, she adjusted her expectations. She expected the world to accommodate her discomfort without changing her choices. That's when I realized the lesson wasn't over. Not even close. 2 days later, I received an official HOA notice. Polite. Formal. Concerned. It referenced landscaping modifications and resident safety. It suggested a review meeting. No accusation. No demand. Just pressure wrapped in paperwork. Carol walked past again that same morning, eyes forward, jaw tight. She didn't look at the lawn. She didn't look at my house. She passed through faster than ever, as if speed alone could erase discomfort. I smiled for the first time since this began. The meeting was scheduled for the following week. Carol would be there. I would be there. And so would the documentation she didn't know existed. The trap hadn't sprung fully yet. It had only shaken her certainty. That was necessary. It primed the moment, built the contrast, made what came next impossible to dismiss as coincidence or complaint. That night, I reviewed everything one more time. The photos, the timestamps, the clauses highlighted in quiet confidence. I didn't feel nervous. I felt calm, prepared. Outside, the lawn rested under soft moonlight, looking harmless and ordinary. A shortcut waiting patiently for someone who refused to stop taking it. Carol still believed the problem was the ground. She hadn't realized yet that the real problem was her. The HOA meeting room smelled faintly of stale coffee and carpet cleaner, a neutral space designed to feel official without feeling personal. Folding chairs lined the walls. A long table sat at the front beneath fluorescent lights that buzzed softly, casting everything in a flat, unforgiving glow. It was the kind of room where decisions were made quickly and accountability was often delayed. Carol arrived early. Of course she did. She sat near the center, posture rigid, papers neatly stacked in front of her as if order itself would bend to her will. She looked composed, but not relaxed. The confidence she usually wore like armor felt thinner today, stretched tight over irritation. I took a seat near the back. Quiet, observant, unassuming. That was where power actually lived in meetings like this, away from theatrics, closer to facts. As residents filed in, low murmurs filled the room. Everyone knew why we were there, though no one said it outright. Landscaping safety. Property concerns. Neutral language masking a personal grievance. Carol nodded politely at board members, her expression practiced, professional. She never looked at me. Not once. The meeting opened with routine business. Approvals. Announcements. The rhythm of bureaucracy lulled the room into complacency. Then Carol's moment arrived. She cleared her throat, and the room shifted its attention instinctively toward her. She spoke calmly, carefully. She referenced safety, liability, community standards. She avoided names but emphasized urgency, suggesting certain landscaping choices posed risks to residents simply passing through. The wording was deliberate. She framed herself as a protector, not an accuser. Heads nodded. Pens scratched across paper. Then the board chair asked if anyone wished to respond. That was my cue. I stood slowly, not dramatic, not hesitant. The room turned. Carol's head snapped toward me for the first time, surprise flashing across her face before hardening into something colder. I spoke plainly. I described my property. The repeated damage. The consistent pattern of foot traffic across a clearly defined lawn. No emotion. No accusation. Just sequence and fact. I referenced dates. Times. Frequency. The room grew quieter. I provided documentation. Photos appeared on the screen behind the board. Clear angles. Visible boundaries. Repetition undeniable even to those who wished not to see it. The grass didn't lie. Neither did timestamps. Carol shifted in her chair. Then came the bylaws. The clauses most people never bothered to read. Property lines. Trespass liability. Owner responsibility in cases of repeated disregard. I didn't explain them. I read them. Slowly. Exactly as written. The atmosphere changed. Questions followed, not from residents, but from the board. Real questions. Clarifying ones. The kind that rearrange assumptions. Carol attempted to interject once, then twice, but each time she was gently redirected. She wasn't in control anymore. Someone asked if I had ever invited foot traffic across my lawn. I answered honestly. No. Someone else asked whether signage or boundaries existed. Photos confirmed they had. The final question landed softly but carried weight. Had anyone been explicitly warned? I didn't need to say a name. The documentation did it for me. Consistency. Awareness. Voice. Carol finally spoke again, her voice tight now, defensiveness slipping through professionalism. She suggested misunderstandings. Habit. Convenience. She implied intent without saying it outright. The board didn't argue. They didn't need to. They closed the discussion with something far worse for her than confrontation. A decision. The ruling was simple. My landscaping met all guidelines. The responsibility for avoiding private property rested on those crossing it. Any further incidents would not be treated as hazards, but as violations. Silence followed. Heavy. Final. Carol stared straight ahead as the meeting moved on, her authority diminished in a way no vote could restore. The power she relied on had shifted quietly, decisively, and without spectacle. When the meeting ended, chairs scraped back. Conversations resumed. People left in small groups, exchanging glances that said more than words. Carol waited until the room was nearly empty before standing. For a moment, I thought she might say something. An accusation. A warning. An appeal. She didn't. She walked past me without a word, heels clicking sharply against the floor, the sound echoing longer than necessary. The confidence was gone, replaced by restraint. Calculation. Outside, evening air cooled my face. The sky dimmed toward blue-black, streetlights flickering on one by one. I felt lighter, not triumphant, but settled. The line had been drawn properly now, not just in soil, but in record. Carol crossed no lawns that night. But entitlement doesn't disappear when challenged. It adapts, retreats, waits. And as I unlocked my door and glanced once more at the quiet stretch of grass beyond it, I knew this wasn't the end. It was just the point where she stopped feeling untouchable. For nearly a week after the meeting, nothing happened. That silence felt deliberate, like the pause before a storm changes direction. My lawn remained untouched, its surface finally beginning to recover, blades lifting slowly as if relieved. I almost allowed myself to believe the lesson had landed cleanly and stayed there. Almost. Carol avoided me entirely. Not just my property, me. When our paths crossed in the neighborhood, she turned her head slightly or checked her phone with exaggerated interest. Her routine had changed. She now took the long way around, stiff and resentful, each extra step clearly costing her something she believed she shouldn't have had to give up. But entitlement rarely accepts loss quietly. It started subtly. A notice appeared on my door about visible soil irregularities, citing aesthetic concerns. It was unsigned, but I recognized the phrasing immediately. Clinical. Official. Carefully vague. I addressed it within hours, sending photographic proof of compliance to the management company. The issue was closed before sunset. The next day, another notice. Trash bin placement. Corrected immediately. Closed again. Then came noise complaints. Anonymous. Unverifiable. Logged and dismissed. Each attempt failed, but the pattern was unmistakable. Carol had shifted strategies. If she couldn't control the lawn, she would try to control everything around it. It wasn't about rules anymore. It was about regaining balance in a world that had finally pushed back. What struck me wasn't the persistence, it was the escalation. She had stopped pretending this was about community standards. This was personal now. I documented everything. Dates. Times. Reports. Each complaint added another layer to a record she didn't know was being built against her. There was a strange calm in that process. The same patience I had used before returned naturally. One evening, I noticed her standing across the street, watching my house longer than necessary. Not casually. Assessing. The streetlight above her flickered faintly, casting half her face in shadow. She didn't wave. She didn't move. She simply stood there until I looked back, then turned sharply and walked away. That night, I slept lightly. not out of fear, but awareness. 2 days later, the moment she had been waiting for arrived. It was raining. Not heavily. Just enough to blur edges and dull sounds. I heard the crunch before I saw her. A familiar sound I hadn't heard in days. I moved to the window slowly. Carol stood at the edge of my lawn, hesitating. The sidewalk glistened beside her, slick but safe. She looked down at the grass, now softened by rain, and I saw something unsettling cross her expression. Not carelessness. Calculation. She stepped forward. Her foot sank deeper than expected. She stumbled, not dramatically, but unmistakably. Arms flared. Balance broke. This time, she didn't recover cleanly. She caught herself on one knee before standing abruptly, face flushed, jaw clenched tight with humiliation. She looked up immediately. Straight at my window. We locked eyes. There was no shock in her expression this time. Only anger. The kind sharpened by embarrassment and pride wounded too deeply to ignore. She stood there for a long moment, rain dotting her hair, then turned and walked away, back the long way. An hour later, the police arrived. Not rushing. Not aggressive. Routine. A complaint had been called in regarding a potential hazard and a hostile property owner. The words felt almost rehearsed. I answered calmly. Provided documentation. Explained the repeated trespass. Showed the previous HOA ruling. The officers listened. They nodded. They took notes. One of them walked the edge of the lawn, careful not to step across it. The visit ended politely. Professionally. Nothing further required. Carol watched from her porch the entire time. Arms crossed. Expression frozen. That was the moment the conflict changed shape. Authority had been tested, and failed. Publicly. Quietly. Completely. The next HOA update arrived 2 days later. A notice about misuse of reporting channels. About repeated unfounded complaints. About consequences for harassment. The language was general, but the meaning was precise. Carol stopped filing complaints after that. Instead, she withdrew. Avoided common spaces. Skipped meetings. Her presence faded from the daily rhythm of the neighborhood like a sound turned down gradually, not cut off entirely. I didn't celebrate. There was no satisfaction in watching someone unravel their own control. Only clarity. Entitlement survives on momentum. Once stopped, it collapses under its own weight. One afternoon, I reseeded the damaged patch. I worked slowly, deliberately, the smell of wet soil filling the air. As I finished, I noticed Carol watching from behind her curtains. She didn't come outside. She didn't speak. She never crossed the lawn again. But the real consequence wasn't the shortcut she lost. It was the authority she could never quietly reclaim. By the time the HOA notice went out announcing a special review meeting, Carol had already vanished from the daily life of the neighborhood. Her car still sat in the driveway. Her lights still came on at night. But the version of her that once moved through the community with authority and certainty was gone. The sidewalks felt quieter without her presence enforcing invisible hierarchies. The meeting wasn't scheduled because of me. That much was clear. The wording focused on pattern concerns, abuse of authority, and administrative review. Language carefully chosen to sound neutral, even fair. But everyone knew what it meant. When rules stop protecting the powerful and start protecting the process, something has shifted permanently. I attended without expectation. Whatever happened now was no longer personal. It hadn't been for some time. Carol arrived late. That alone told the story better than anything she could have said. She took a seat near the edge of the room, posture tight, expression guarded. She didn't greet anyone. She didn't attempt small talk. She sat like someone waiting for weather to pass, not realizing the storm was already inside the building. The board chair opened with procedure. Come. Methodical. Then the review began. What unfolded was less dramatic than rumors had suggested, but far more damaging. A timeline appeared on the screen. Complaints filed. Reports initiated. Warnings issued and ignored. Patterns emerged where individual incidents once hid. The room grew still as residents recognized just how often Carol's name appeared, not as an enforcer, but as a source. There were no accusations. Just records. Neutral. Impersonal. Devastating. The misuse of reporting systems. Repeated unfounded complaints. Attempts to leverage authority for personal grievance. Everything I had quietly documented sat among much larger evidence collected from others who had never spoken before. Carol didn't interrupt. She stared forward, face pale, hands clasped too tightly. The confidence she once wielded had nowhere to rest now. The board spoke in turns. One acknowledged her years of service. Another spoke of responsibility. Another referenced trust, how easily it erodes when power is treated as entitlement rather than duty. The decision wasn't dramatic. There was no raised voice. No vote counted aloud. Just a conclusion reached with uncomfortable inevitability. Carol was removed from her position effective immediately. The room exhaled collectively. She stood slowly, chair scraping louder than necessary, and left without a word. No farewell. No protest. Just the sound of someone walking out of a role she believed defined her. Outside, dusk settled over the neighborhood like a curtain closing. I walked home alone, thinking not of victory, but of boundaries, how fragile they are until defended, how strong they become once respected. Weeks passed. The lawn healed fully. Grass thickened. Color returned. What had once been a scar blended back into something whole. Carol eventually sold her house. Quietly. There was no farewell message. No explanation. Just a listing that appeared one morning and disappeared just as quickly. New neighbors moved in shortly after. They used the sidewalk. They waved politely. They never crossed the lawn. Life returned to its ordinary rhythm. Sometimes, early in the morning, I stood by the same window where this began. The street sounded the same as it always had. Birds. Engines. Footsteps kept to their proper paths. What lingered wasn't satisfaction. It was certainty. Entitlement relies on the belief that no one will push back, that convenience justifies disregard, that power is permanent. Carol believed all of that. And she was wrong. The trap she walked into wasn't hidden in soil or planning. It was built from her own assumptions. Every step she took across my lawn reinforced the idea that rules applied to others, never her. Justice didn't arrive loudly. It arrived patiently, methodically, fairly. And in the end, she lost more than a shortcut. She lost the authority she misused, the respect she assumed, and the illusion that consequences were optional. The lawn remains untouched now, not because of fear, but because boundaries, once restored, tend to hold. And that, more than anything, is what entitlement can never forgive.